The gospel reading comes from the 18th chapter of Luke. We're still in that section of Luke where Jesus is headed towards Jerusalem. And the specter of Jerusalem and the cross is always there in the background. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Many years ago, I preached a sermon from today's gospel reading, one where a couple of members of the congregation helped do a dramatic reading of the parable with it updated just a bit. The Pharisee became an upstanding church member, and the tax collector became a drug dealer. Now, the first change is pretty obvious. Pharisees were the upstanding Protestants of their day. The second change maybe deserves some explanation. Tax collectors in the time of Jesus were not civil service employees. They were part of a rather strange, corrupt system that permitted them to pry all the money they could manage to do from their community, from the people in their community. The Romans didn't care how much they totally collected, as long as Rome got their prescribed amount. The tax collectors could keep everything else for themselves. They often used threats and intimidation to get as much as they could, and they often preyed on the most vulnerable, the least powerful in their community. They got wealthy, fabulously wealthy, all while doing this work for an occupying foreign power. They make modern-day slumlords seem charitable by comparison, and they were rightly despised. And so in church on that Sunday, the upstanding church member stood and thanked God that he was not like thieves and robbers and other sorts of lowlife, certainly not like a drug dealer. He tithed to his church and then some. He served on committees and on the session, and he never missed worship on a Sunday if he was in town. But the drug dealer would not come to the front, stood off to the side, kept his head down. Drug dealer pulled at his clothes and his hair and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And well, you've already heard the parable, so you know what Jesus says next. Now, a few days after this sermon, I received a letter in the office. Email was still pretty new, so I got letters back then. a letter from a church member who was not very happy with my sermon. "Who do you think's going to keep the church going?" started the letter. "Who's going to pay your salary if not for upstanding church members like the one you swapped for the Pharisee? Certainly not going to be the drug dealers." And I couldn't really argue with him there. The fact of the matter is, in many churches, we're dependent on a small portion of the members to give a great deal of the money. Tithers are rare, and they're getting rarer. Of course, it's Jesus that stirs up all the trouble. It's his story, it's not mine. I just tried to update it a little bit. I mean, the last thing I want is Jesus telling a story condemning tithers in the middle of stewardship season. Now, I don't recall many details of the conversation I ended up having with this church member. I probably said something about how, well, the point of the parable was not that he was bad because he was upstanding or because he tithed. It was because that he thought this made him better than other people in the eyes of God. Whatever I said, the fellow calmed down. Although he was still a bit miffed about the drug dealer part. And I suspect people in Jesus' day felt the same way about the tax collector part. Perhaps that's why the gospel writer feels the need to say a little something before he lets Jesus speak in the reading for today. He writes, "Jesus also told this parable to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt." Luke says that the two issues in the parable are what do you ultimately trust, and how do you regard others? And the two questions end up being intertwined. Now, those of us who are religiously inclined are prone to trust in our way of being religious. I mean, it's sort of unavoidable, I suppose. But too often it goes well beyond that. We start to trust in our ways of doing things, and those can actually become our God. One way to tell what's really holy in a church congregation is to observe those things people get worked up about or that they fight about. There's an old joke that says the biggest fights in congregations are over the color of the sanctuary carpet. In my own experience, they've been over other style-type issues, the order of worship, the hymns to sing, the style of the music involved. Quite often there's some Pharisee-like judgments involved. We don't do that kind of music here. That referring to whatever sort of music we find inferior to the one that we prefer. Now, we Presbyterians typically don't label those we disagree with as sinners. But we do know Christians who do. We know people who say you've got to do it this way, our way, or you're wrong, you're going to hell. We often tell people, oh, we're not that kind of Christian. Thank God we're not like them, said the Pharisee. Jesus' parable doesn't tell us a whole lot about the people. It tells us something about the Pharisee, a little bit about him. It tells us nothing about the tax collector. Why is he there praying in the temple? I mean, the tax collector has decided that what really matters to him is money and wealth and power. He's made his choices to get money at all cost. He's decided that it's wealth and possessions that will bring happiness and fulfillment and meaning. And yet, here he is in the temple, begging for God's mercy. We don't know what has happened or how it has happened, but somehow the objects this tax collector has trusted have somehow failed him. He has money and possessions, but his gods have not fulfilled their promises. Despite all of his wealth, he finds himself somehow adrift, alienated, lost, maybe even a little hopeless. And so he throws himself on God's mercy. He is stripped bare, and all he can do is entrust himself fully to God. Be merciful to me, a sinner. C.S. Lewis, the author of all those Narnia books and Mere Christianity and lots of others, went through a faith crisis following the death of his wife, one he recounts in his book, A Grief Observed. And he talks about how devastating the loss was, how nothing could fill the place, the hole that she had left. She was what he needed. It wouldn't do to have memories or stories he recalled or pictures of her. He needed her, not those. And through the agony and the struggle, he actually came to a deeper faith and started to recognize that images, knowledge, and understanding of Christ simply would not do. In fact, they often got in the way of what he really, truly needed, Christ himself. He writes, "My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time." He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? I wonder if Father Richard Rohr isn't speaking of something similar when he writes that true transformation happens only via the path of descent. We must go down to go up. We must find ourselves stripped bare, images and past we trusted shattered, in order finally to entrust ourselves fully and wholly to God, that we might be made new. But oh, how that scares us. Now, if you're a church member here, or even if you've just sort of paid decent attention to the bulletin, you likely know that it's stewardship season. That means this is supposed to be a stewardship sermon. And I assumed when I started working on it that it'd be not too difficult to tie something together about those things in which we ultimately place our trust and how that shows up in our giving and our serving. But sermons sometimes have minds of their own, and this one ended up where it wanted to go. But it strikes me that if we somehow find ourselves in a place like that of the tax collector, if we somehow intentionally or by accident stumble onto that path of descent and find ourselves stripped bare, if we somehow fall into the love and grace of God, surely we will be changed, maybe even transformed. And then, surely, our lives will in some way reflect the theme that the Stewardship Committee chose for this year: inspired to give as beloved children of God. All praise and glory to the God who comes in Christ, giving himself for us. Thanks be to God.